Gabriela, Rosa, welcome to the Orgasmic Lifestyle Podcast. Thank you so much for taking part in this interview today. For those who are unfamiliar with your work, could you tell us what you do?
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Venus. It's lovely to be here, and I love how connected your discussions are. So thank you. What we do is actually help couples overcome infertility and recurrent miscarriage when other treatments have failed, typically. And I've been doing that since 2001, so it's been a long time. But really, challenges are the bulk of what it is that we help couples overcome.
What inspired you to follow this path?
It's a great question. I think that, when I was young and trying to decide what am I going to do with my life, I remember I used to work with an obstetrician gynecologist who's still a wonderful mentor of mine to this day. And he basically said to me one day as I was kind of deciding, where I was going to focus my career, that the idea of focusing on pediatrics was the worst idea I've ever had. you know, and I was like, oh, tell me what you really think. And so I kind of decided to rethink that because he did make a good point, which is, if you're focusing on pediatrics, your patient's not your patient. It's the parent of your patient, and your patient can't speak. And so I was like, well, actually, that's very true. And I think that those are additional challenges that already make something that is, helping somebody's recovery and optimizing their health a challenge. When those factors are in place, it makes it even more difficult. So I decided to rethink that strategy, and eventually I was diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome,
Mm.
which is one of the biggest causes of infertility in females of a reproductive age. And with that diagnosis, I thought, it's going to be, and it's 15% of the world population suffers from it, from the female world population. So I thought, you know what? I think that it would be great for me to be able to learn how to address this for myself and my health in the long term, but also it will be something that I'm sure I can help other people, achieve. And so that's what ended up happening. And, needless to say that that journey, it was challenging to begin with because the only kind of guidance that I received at the age of 18 when I was diagnosed was like, well, by this doctor on the telephone, you're probably never going to have children. That's really what it means. Because I was like, when he said to me, you have polycystic ovarian disease, I was like, what does that mean? Am I going to die? Um, and I realized that I wasn't going to die, not at least fast, but because of it. But that, I did need to adjust some things and to learn more to be able to help myself. And it became, something that I then followed that career path for the last 2 decades.
Wow, it's really fascinating because I've been a sexual wellness content creator for 15 years this summer, and I have never ever had a conversation with anyone about fertility, which is so interesting because if you think about it, just a generation before or even before then, sex was just about procreation, whereas the sexuality I'm talking about is pleasure and intimacy. So it's so interesting, I think, that, we spend so much of our lives, using contraception, birth control,
Yes.
and then you get to a point where actually I want to have a baby now, and then people are having a difficult time. So when I first saw your profile, the first thing that came to mind was IVF, and then I saw it's actually natural fertility. This is so
Mm.
interesting. So
Yeah.
can you tell us about what does that mean actually?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that what you've touched on is so true and so relevant. Like the majority of people still to this day conceive without trying,
Mm.
right? And that's what we hear is like, when somebody goes off the pill, decides that they want to have a baby, or they're not even on the pill and they just kind of have that, surprise of, oops, I'm pregnant, positive pregnancy test, period didn't arrive, and people think that that's kind of like an unplanned thing. The reality is that that's how most people conceive in the general population. It's kind of like the way. And for the other rest of the people who basically are on the pill and decide to come off, most people conceive very quickly within the first 3 months. When that doesn't happen and it starts to become more kind of like long standing, then we start to question and figure out, well, why is this happening? And then, of course, once it hits that 12-month mark, then it becomes infertility. But the thing about what we do that's different is really helping people to understand what are the obstacles that are getting in the way. Because sometimes it's not just one thing, you know, and what IVF tries to do is really bypass any of the particular reasons as to why somebody might be having difficulty conceiving or keeping a healthy pregnancy to term by just getting the egg and the sperm together. Let's get an embryo, let's transfer that embryo, and hopefully with that strategy, bypass some of the issues that might be getting in the way in the vaginal canal and or a challenge that the sperm might be having of getting to the egg. But what happens is that, you know, fertility, like, you know, and if we reverse that, it would be infertility and miscarriage. These things are end results. You know, they are outcomes of multiple biochemical chain reactions that start much before you actually have that result, right? And what IVF tries to do is really just kind of like work on it from a very low leverage point, which is let's get the egg, let's get the sperm, create an embryo, and hope for the best. When that doesn't happen or doesn't work, and you know, we know from population data around the world that 70% or thereabouts of IVF cycles actually fail. Then we're left with having to scratch our head and go, but hang on a second, why is that happening here? And sometimes there's a combination of a variety of factors, you know, like it can be anything from male fertility factors to ovulatory factors to immunological components or aspects to environmental exposure to diet, to lifestyle. You know, there's lots of different reasons as to why somebody might be struggling or might be having difficulty to conceive and or to keep a healthy pregnancy to term. So really the idea behind what it is that we do is that we want to diagnose the problem accurately and properly. Because what happens is that, again, if we talk about healthcare systems, you know, and I'm doing a doctorate at Harvard on public health, which, you know, kind of talks to us about the fact that, okay, how do we do the most for the largest number of people in the population by implementing or using the least amount of resources? When it comes to fertility, we can't think like that, or infertility, we can't think like that, because the people who do not conceive just without trying, they typically have very specific reasons as to why that's happening. So the general population advice of you go to a GP and the GP just makes sure that, you know, you are ovulating, that there is sperm, and that your fallopian tubes aren't blocked. Really, that's kind of like 3 tests, right? It's going not to be enough for people who are experiencing infertility, particularly long-standing infertility. And in our clinic, we treat people who have typically, on average, been having challenges with infertility for 4 years or more, right? And so these people really do struggle with something that in standard therapy or just kind of like in the day-to-day is not going to be enough to uncover what it is that is affecting them. So we get much deeper into, you know, all of these other aspects, like the foundation of optimum health, of course, which is derived from our exposures and lifestyle and environment and all the things that we do in our day-to-day, but then also to really truly uncover from a diagnostic perspective, like what are the issues that are really impacting this particular situation. And not only from a female perspective, even though, you know, typically when it comes to fertility or any kind of reproductive challenge, miscarriage and so on, it's usually thought that, oh, it's a female problem. But it's not, because, you know, fertility is a team sport. We have 50% of that equation is the egg, 50% is the sperm. And if we are even more accurate than that, we can say that 40% of reasons as to why miscarriage or infertility occurs is because of male factor, 40% is because of female factor, and 20% is because of idiosyncratic factors, which is, you know, a combination of various things. So that's really what we do, and that's how we are different. It's not that it's a us versus them, you know, in terms of like, you know, some of our patients still do benefit from going down the IVF path, because let's say, for example, in situations where they may have other issues, but also have blocked fallopian tubes, they're not going to conceive naturally in those situations. But those people typically have had 5 failed IVF cycles, and then figuring out, okay, why is that the case and what do we need to do about it so that we can transform that particular outcome is really our genius.
So imagine someone doesn't have any kind of big issues that you found with your diagnostic methods. What would be, say, some tips that you would share with a couple, let's say for the female and for the male? Would there any kind of tips to kind of enhance? And how important is doing it around ovulation?
Yeah, no, look, that's a great question. And I think that to answer that question, I'm going to take one little step back.
Mm.
Really, first to kind of explain, why is it that people have challenges conceiving to begin with, and what happens when there isn't a proper diagnosis, right? The majority of people in that situation that you've just described, where they've been trying for a while, but there's no major visible cause of their infertility or miscarriage, are typically diagnosed with unexplained infertility or miscarriage, which in my opinion is the worst possible diagnosis you could give anyone, because it means absolutely nothing. Unexplained does not mean unexplainable. But the problem is that if you don't know, for example, the reason why you have a leak in your home, right, how are you going to go about fixing it? Right. So that's kind of the analogy that I like to use. It's like figuring out, okay, first of all, we may not know why immediately on face value, but then this is why diagnosis is so important. Like really following the trail of what are some of these issues that are getting in the way is going to be so critical, because we really need to understand and therefore better explain why that is happening or not happening for a particular person. So that's step one. Then step two becomes exactly what you've just asked, which is, okay, well, we may or may not know exactly immediately, but what else can we do, right? What else? What are some of the pathways forward in this particular situation? And in that, I like to recommend to couples, act pregnant now to get pregnant later. And
Oh, that's
what do I mean
interesting.
by that?
It's like
Yeah.
act as if, like law of attraction.
That too, right? But it's actually, what do I mean by that? Well, the reality is that any person right now who may want to conceive in the future already has 50% of that little baby that they would like to create within them, right? So they already have, women, all the eggs we will ever have in our lifetime. Men are producing sperm all the time, but they already have the sperm that are going to essentially affect the pregnancy. And that's being formed and reformed every 4 months. But the reality of it is that if that is true, which it is, biologically speaking, and we want to bring those cells together to create an embryo, guess what? Are those cells going to be healthier or less healthy if we optimize the way in which we live our lives in general? Of course, they're going to be healthier, right? So what I typically say is that because you already have 50% of that little baby that you want to create inside of you, your job from here is to do all of the things that you absolutely would do if you were like pregnant right now. What are all of the things? And I often ask men to indulge me and imagine the ability and the possibility of being pregnant. But, and I know that for sometimes it's hard for them, but it's kind of like, just try to imagine if you were the one gestating that baby and it was your responsibility to bring it to term. What would it look like? What are all of the things that you absolutely would start doing or stop doing if you were pregnant right now? And for most people, they would answer that question beautifully. They would say, well, I would eat well, I would exercise, I would quit smoking, I would not drink alcohol, I would avoid coffee, I would, whatever it is, I would avoid toxins in my environment, I would drink filtered water, I would eat organic food, whatever it is, right? And I call those the foundations to optimum health and the foundations to optimum fertility. What's absolutely brilliant and beautiful about the body, and I'm sure that you agree with me, is that often when we just remove those obstacles to optimum fertility, it is absolutely magical what the body can actually do, right? How it can make itself healthy again and regenerate in ways that we didn't even imagine possible. And that's what we see for our patients at the Rosa Institute. When we actually help them to really uncover what is their fastest potential for optimum fertility and optimum health, that's when transformation begins.
Interesting. I actually saw this really interesting documentary in the UK years ago, and it was about what's the best age of motherhood. And I can't remember the exact title, but it was about they were following, let's say, a teenage pregnancy, like quite a young girl, a late teenager, 20-year-old, 30-year-old, and then a 40-year-old. And it was comparing all these different experiences. And it was so interesting because the younger kind of ones, they were just adapting to motherhood just because they had nothing to compare it to. Whereas the oldest one was she'd done IVF, she'd had her career, and she kind of maybe left it quite late. I think that's a big topic as well for women now, because I think a lot of people, they're delaying motherhood because, personal life situations, you can't schedule this your emotional life, is very hard. And sometimes it's nice to date people without thinking, is this the father? It's just kind of nice to be in the
Yes.
moment. And then sometimes people just realize a bit too late and you want to get established with your career. What do you think about that? How much is age? How important is age? Let's say if you're following, let's say, a healthy lifestyle, what is the cutoff time and when would you have to kind of resort to not so natural methods?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, what you're saying is very, very true, which is that whole idea of, the fact that if we look back, our grandmothers were grandmothers at age 40,
Wow.
right? And in fact, probably some even younger.
Mm.
And so, the truth is that this populational shift in terms of fertility is definitely occurring. And we are leaving it to have babies later. But it's also because life expectancy has increased so drastically. Think about it in the time that our grandparents were, kind of alive, or even our great grandparents. By age 60, most of them were actually very, very, very old and fragile and dying, really, unfortunately. Right. But these days, you look at a 60-year-old and you can still put them on the cover of a magazine, so to
Mm.
speak. Right. And so it's kind of like, and of course, many things have changed. And, the age positivity has certainly been something that has been a transformation in our society. But unfortunately, fertility has not followed suit in terms of that, because what has happened is that as much as our life expectancy has increased, our fertility window is still very much what it was all those generations back, right? And so then we have to question, it's like, okay, well, what makes sense for me in my life? And some women also don't find some partners, until much later in life. And, there's all of these difficulties and challenges that can sometimes arise. So I would say that, and also this is another factor, is that depending on a person's history, life history, family history, medical history, the answer to that question may be different, right? Let me give you an example. There's lots of data that suggests that if a woman smokes, she is more likely to enter menopause 5 years before their non-smoking counterpart. So that means that if women are starting to feel the effects of perimenopause 5 to 10 years before menopause occurs, which typically speaking would be around 45 to 50, and the effect of perimenopause would be happening between 35 and 40. If a woman smokes, that might be 30 to 35.
Wow.
You see, so then we start to question, okay, like smoking, what are some of these other risk factors that might even further affect the way in which the egg and the sperm mature and are able to create and form embryos? So, not to be the bearer of terrible news, the truth is that our lifestyle is not fertility friendly.
Mm.
Right. And that's just typically how it is. But there are lots of things that people can do. And like I said before, it is incredible what the body is capable of and what's possible when we give it the opportunity. So I always say we should be teaching, instead of teaching, contraception and family planning the way that we do in school, we should be teaching about how do we optimize our health so that we can be fertile for when we actually want to have babies, because everything that we do in our lifetime will determine and will affect the quality of our eggs in the future, the ability to conceive, keep a healthy pregnancy to term, but especially what we do in the 6 months before trying to conceive. It also has a huge impact. So for some women, it may make sense depending on their career plans, their life plans, whether they have met partners or not. It may make sense that they might choose to freeze their eggs before, they kind of get too old, so to speak, quote unquote. And I don't believe in too old anyway, because I think that there are lots of things that we can do to really optimize chances. But the reality is that, our fertility window will start to get smaller and smaller as time progresses. It's not a falling off a cliff from one day to another. You turn 35 and all of a sudden, you're infertile, as many societal beliefs, kind of want to lead us to accept. But it certainly does, have that decline over the time of a lifetime of a female.
So when we think about, yeah, exactly, you said the female, but what about the male, the aging male?
Great question. And, we often think about the female and often only talk about the female,
Mm.
but male sperm and sperm parameters are also impacted. And we see that over the age of 35, 40, because of accumulation of fragmentation within the DNA of the sperm, which is where essentially the information that's carried to make a baby is present, it actually increases with time and age. And so the ability of an 80-year-old or 90-year-old, even though, Hugh Hefner, I think it was, that had a 90 made a Playboy bunny pregnant at 20. The reason that something like that would happen is because at 20, the peak fertility time of a woman is at play. Therefore, healthy, strong eggs, which the egg's first kind of job when the sperm fertilizes it is to fix the errors, the DNA fragmentation within the sperm.
Oh,
So what
wow.
happens is that a 20-year-old egg can actually handle that job even with a 90-year-old man. But it doesn't always equate that you're going to have, an older man with a much younger woman. Typically, partners are around the same age, or the man is a bit older than the woman. And if the egg is already kind of struggling a little bit to do its job and have the energy production within its mitochondria to fix those errors and develop an embryo, then we end up with issues like fertilization failure, implantation failure, miscarriage, and we end up with the conversation of infertility and miscarriage at down the track. So yes, male fertility is also affected by time and the age factor.
Mm. So when I think about a couple, let's say, making love to create life, I think that must have been the most incredible experience emotionally, and to actually, have a different intention. It's not just about, the intimacy and the pleasure, but that was obviously part of it as well, especially the emotional intimacy. But I can imagine that can start off being very beautiful. I have friends who've told me incredible stories about it, but then it gets to a point where you're trying every time you get a period and it becomes this big disappointment. It can become very mechanical to the point where when it does work, I remember a friend told me that, it was come home from work and just she was on all fours and just like in, out, shake all about and just wait, with feet against the wall. And then as soon as she'd conceived, it's like game over. So that's kind of like when it works out. But then when it's not working out, I can imagine it just gets very mechanical and very disappointing, and it really takes its toll on the relationship. Do you have any tips about that? About how to
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and what you're saying is unfortunately a lot of the time where I see my patients,
Mm.
because they have been trying for many years, they have done lots of different things that haven't worked, and it becomes more than disappointing, it becomes traumatizing to
Mm.
see a negative pregnancy test or literally getting a period, something that's so normal and natural and we celebrate typically when it comes to that time where a couple really wants to achieve a healthy pregnancy and hold their baby. when it's not happening, it's extremely challenging. So I'm sure that you will have lots of tips, you know, in terms of how people can rekindle that intimacy and that passion. But one of the things that I often recommend to my patients is really just not to see a conception attempt as purely a conception attempt, but as an opportunity to connect with that other person that they want to create a child with. Right. And so, and even just, you know, from the perspective of like, it doesn't, throughout the month when people are trying to conceive, typically it's like, oh, I don't want to see you. I don't want to touch you. I don't want to have sex. That's not going to be ideal for what needs to happen when we actually need to get to the time of the month where sex is needed, right? To be able to create the outcome that you're looking for. So creating an opportunity and a way throughout each week and each day even to just be kind to each other and be supportive of each other and just be loving, right? Even if it doesn't necessarily mean intercourse, I think is something that, you know, really does support that transition from, okay, now we're going to actually have sex to have a baby, right? And trying to figure out, okay, how, because this is another thing that often happens and it just comes to mind, is that sometimes people's frustrations become misplaced on that journey to parenthood, right? Like women become really frustrated about the fact that here they are telling their partner what they need to do in order for them to get pregnant, and he's not listening, or he's not participating, or he's not, you know, really understanding his role in the whole context of what they're trying to do as a couple. And so women become really resentful of the fact that, you know, they're having to say these things that they're not being heard, and then translates into, and then I see a negative pregnancy test, and then I get a period, and then it's your fault, right? So that kind of blame game is really the one thing. Like if there was one thing to avoid in a couple, in a couple's relationship when it comes to trying to get pregnant, and certainly to have that intimacy and connection, is really to really try to avoid seeing it in that light, and really kind of looking at the situation as, okay, how can we work together, right, in order to be able to create this result that we both want to create? And one of the things that I say to my patients is this. I say to the woman, listen, it is not your job to tell your partner what to do. It is your job to help them to be educated about what it is that they can do to contribute to what it is that both of you say that you want to create. And so if the worst case scenario happens, that they need to be told, quote unquote, what to do, let that be my job. You know, because then it takes that angst from the relationship. It's like all of a sudden he can hate me. It's okay if he hates me. It's not going to change the ability of that couple having a child, right? But if they hate each other, that's really going to be very detracting from what it is that we're trying to achieve. Right. And of course, if there are serious relationship problems, it's important to address those, because trying to sweep them under the carpet is not going to be the best way. And a baby is not going to fix your relationship. I can guarantee you that. I've had 20 plus years of experience in treating couples and seeing that entire process play out from beginning to baby and beyond, to be adamant about the fact that do not think that your partner is going to be different or better or whatever because you're having a baby. In fact, if anything, the baby often becomes, unfortunately, a source of additional to-dos in a daily life, right? Which, if again, we're not playing this game as best as we can by having the connection, the mutual respect, the intimacy, it is going to play out in a way that's less than ideal, right, for family life down the track. And that's where a lot of couples then, kind of lose themselves in that context. But it is possible to address. It's certainly possible to prevent. But you do need to be aware of these factors, because otherwise it's just very easy to go by the default of what typically happens, in the situation. And many people are not best served by default.
I read an
I think
article
being
years ago.
deliberate is important.
I read an article years ago in The Guardian that said that having a baby was like throwing a grenade at a relationship. And it said if you think that's
No,
extreme, you've not had a baby. But I think, adding to the mix what you've just described, if you add, sleep deprivation, I mean, I had not a great night's sleep last night and I'm a bit grumpy today. I feel like I've not done it as much as I wanted to do, but I can't imagine what it must be like to have like 3 months or 6 months of sleep deprivation. That must be
or
really,
5 years,
wow.
like some,
Yeah.
because that's a reality, like, and so what
Mm.
happens is you do, I'm glad that you said the analogy of the grenade, not me, but the reality of it is that, it is an additional thing that you not thing, but like an additional piece that requires management, when it comes to like a brand new transition from being a couple to then being a family, right? From two to three, it is the greatest transition you will ever have. And then from three to four, you think that, there is economies of scale and you think that it's going to be the same, but it's yet again another massive transition that you're going to have. So having a strong relationship through all of that, and having, I guess, the best way that I can describe this is having commonality. I
Mm.
think John Gottman, who's a wonderful researcher, has put out some amazing work, research work on the field of relationships. Talks about the fact that these love maps and these connections that couples can build and create together is the most foundational piece of having a healthy and good relationship once the baby arrives, right? And his book "And Baby Makes Three" I highly recommend. It's a really great book for people who are going through that transition as well.
So would you recommend, let's say, getting rid of like ovulation tracking and all that type of thing, just to kind of make things a bit more spontaneous?
You see, it's a catch-22. Because for some people, getting rid of ovulation tracking is going to essentially decrease their chances of conception,
Mm.
right? For some people, it's not effective anyway, and it just adds to
Mm.
the challenge of what's going on for a couple. So this is where I always say that unless you understand what it is that you're dealing with, it's very impossible to fix it effectively. So, for some people, the ovulation tracking is good. Like, for example, let me give you an example. If somebody has a regular cycle and they're not really sure exactly what day they're ovulating, we know that sperm lasts in the vaginal canal and the uterine canal, uterine cavity. It lasts between 3 to 5 days. So we know that the best time to have intercourse is going to be at least 24 hours before ovulation happens, because otherwise you miss ovulation, you miss the ability of the egg and sperm to actually meet. And in fact, 3 to 4, like 3 days is the ideal time. Intercourse 3 to 2 days before ovulation is going to be ideal. But it's difficult to pinpoint because the LH surge happens 12 hours before ovulation, right? So, and this is also why on its own, I don't recommend ovulation kits because I find them to be a waste of money. The best thing is for a woman to be tracking her cycle via temperature, understanding when she's likely to ovulate, also understanding her symptoms, and then trying to time what's going on. Remembering also that in a particular cycle, let's say, for example, the ovaries, they alternate in releasing the egg, which can change the hormonal profile of each cycle for a woman, which can also change the way and the timing of ovulation. So, and what a woman even experiences beforehand. So that's why the more data you have is going to be better to be able to actually make those predictions. For most couples, if there is a regular cycle, trying from day 10 to day 20 of the menstrual cycle to conceive, and trying every second day. So let's say day 12, day 10, day 12, day 14, day 16, day 18, day 20 is pretty much going to hit a fertile window. So in those cases where there is enough intercourse happening and people kind of have a sense that they have a regular cycle, maybe and the tracking is only adding to the stress of the
Mm.
situation, well, then maybe it makes sense to not track, just have more regular intercourse and be okay with it. For others, they might not know. They might have complete, kind of lack of clarity around when they're ovulating, or they might, like me, have completely irregular cycles. Right. So when I was trying to conceive, and I actually was one of my own patients in the clinic, and I conceived two healthy baby boys, naturally without, the need for IVF or any drugs or anything like that. Part of my strategy was really understanding really deeply when I was ovulating. And for me, and I was doing that by tracking my temperatures every single day, charting them, and just understanding it wasn't a stressful thing. It was just literally something I would roll over, wake up, roll over, get the thermometer, put in my mouth. These days, there are all sorts of trackers that are automatic, like even, the Aura Ring, no conflict of interest, but the Aura Ring now tracks cycles. So, back when I was trying to have a baby, my kids are now 12 and 9. So this technology wasn't available. But if it was, I would have certainly, utilized it to my advantage. But what I did have was just a thermometer. And so I just basically would just roll over, put it in my mouth, wait until it beeped, write it on the chart. And that gave me, and I did that for years. And I actually used it for contraception. So the times that I conceived, I was deliberately trying to conceive. It wasn't because I was like, oops, surprise. But I also knew, because I was tracking that data for, years really, I knew that my ovulation wasn't happening on day 14, which was the kind of, textbook ovulation day. It was happening on day 30 or day 33 of each cycle, right? And so I knew that having intercourse, every second day for 10 days between day 10 to 20 was not going to be the strategy that was going to get me pregnant.
Ah, interesting. So you're your own patient.
That's
So
right. So I had to be my own patient. My husband had, very poor sperm parameters, and I had PCOS. So we had to fix those factors before we could actually conceive and have healthy babies, which we did. And, they're now big talking preteens.
a couple of quick questions for you that I ask everyone in this podcast that's kind of unrelated to the topic. What is the book that changed your life?
Oh my God. The new Psychocybernetics by Maxwell Maltz.
The new what, sorry?
The new Psychocybernetics
Oh, okay, it
by
sounds very
Maxwell
unrelated to
Maltz.
fertility.
Completely unrelated, but changed my life, and it's still to this day. It's amazing.
And what's it about?
It's about how your perception molds your reality,
Oh,
right?
wow.
But in a really kind of fascinating way, because this guy was a plastic surgeon, and he would do surgery on some people, and they would absolutely see themselves completely different when they looked in the mirror, and then other people had absolutely no change, and that was because of that self-perception. And he realized that changing that self-perception actually
Wow.
changed so many things in their life. It was really the first time that I came across that concept. I was like, wow, this is incredible.
That's interesting you said that, because that's actually my biggest struggle right now is self-perception, self-concept. So I'm definitely gonna look at that book.
It's a
Just understand.
fabulous book. I highly
Yeah.
recommend it. I reread it from time to time.
Oh, amazing. And what is the quote that you live by, a quote or phrase or affirmation?
Well, that would be W.H. Murray and the Scottish Himalayan expedition. Until one is committed, there is, like basically, it's a long quote, but essentially what it is that unless you are committed to a path, you are always going to have indecisiveness and the chance to draw back, and that does not yield the result that one wants in life. So thank you for reminding me of that quote and reminding me that, that's something to live by forever.
Fantastic. So where can people find you?
They can find me by Googling Gabriela Rosa, Gabriela Rosa, or going to my website, fertilitybreakthrough.com. So Gabriela Rosa, fertilitybreakthrough.com.
Do you work with people globally, or is it always in person, or
We
how do you
do.
work?
No, we have been working with people globally since 2003, and our clinic now is 100% online, and we treat patients in every continent other than Antarctica. So, if people are having difficulty conceiving and want to know more, they can also go and find my book, Fertility Breakthrough, Overcoming Infertility and Recurrent Miscarriage, free on Spotify.
Amazing. Amazing. I'll be reading your book as well. Fantastic. So, Gabriela, Rosa, thank you so much for joining us on the Orgasmic Lifestyle Podcast. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.